Going live, and so both of our speakers are here. Let's give 4 more minutes for all the other people to join, because officially it starts at 10 o'clock. So a lot of people are expected, so let's give a couple of more minutes. In the meantime, I think Sunita ji is here and our team is here. So if you guys want to unofficially chat before the Facebook goes live.
Hey, Jamil, Motika.
Yes.
So, Sunita and I, we don't have background in science or medicine at all. Me, though, not at all. So, would it be better that you and somebody else, maybe Rehman Khan with background in science, ask the questions?
Yes, we will do that. Yes.
Dr. Jamil, we are live. We are live.
We are going to have the chat room open as well. And we have a couple of questions in our WhatsApp group. So, for those WhatsApp questions, I think, anybody can ask, but I would probably take a lead on that.
Sure. So, is Rehan here as well?
Yeah, Dr. Rehan is co-hosting.
Okay, so that's great. So, you guys can do the questions now, okay?
Yes, yes.
That would be great. Thanks.
Jamil bhai, we are live now. We can start.
So can you send the link before we go?
Yes, okay. So I'm muting all for now. Jamil bhai, I'm muting all.
And put it in the chat room as well. Are we ready, Ram?
Yes. I muted everybody and I just gave a mic to you only. Just give me, I'll send the link. Give me 1 minute. So you can start actually.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the conference call organized by Indian Americans Forum with also on board Hindus for Human Rights and Global Indian Progressive Alliance. Our team, myself, Dr. Jamil, Ramakrishna Jalla, and representing Hindus for Human Rights, Sunita Vishwanath ji and Raju Rajgopal ji. And from our Global Indian Progressive Alliance, Dr. Manish Madan. He is also part of our team. And as you know, we have asked two of the eminent pulmonologists, one from USA and one from UK, to be on our call to explain to us what is going on and the current advances with regards to this COVID pandemic. And I will introduce the speaker number one, Dr. Taruj Ali, and then Raju sir will be introducing Dr. Dinesh Saralaya from UK. And then Dr. Taruj will be speaking for 15 to 20 minutes, and then followed by Dr. Dinesh, who will be speaking for 15 to 20 minutes. And then we will take Q&A, and then we'll try to limit this call by 12 o'clock if everything goes right. So I will introduce Dr. Taruj. Let me, at the outset, introduce myself. I'm a physician in US as well, Dr. Jamil. My full name is Dr. Muhammad Jamil. I work in one of the hospitals in Chicago, Illinois, dealing with the COVID clinics. To put out a disclaimer, this presentation and this presence of mine has nothing to do with the institution. It's on the personal level. I will be moderating this call. I'm happy to introduce my friend, who is my batchmate from Hyderabad, Deccan, India, Dr. Taruj Ali. He is finished the medical school in 1998. And then after he completed his residency in internal medicine, followed by fellowship in pulmonary and critical care and sleep medicine from St. Luke's Roosevelt Hospital in New York City. He moved to Richmond, Virginia in 2005 and joined a private practice. He has been ICU director and chief of staff at Henrico Doctors Hospital in Richmond. Over the past 15 years, he has been also involved in clinical trials for various pharmaceutical companies. He has been in the forefront of this COVID pandemic, dealing with the ICU patients. And he also holds the position of medical director at the Pulmonary Associates of Richmond. He was voted the top doctor in his specialty by Richmond Magazine in 2019 and again in 2020. And I'm very proud for being a batchmate and a classmate back from Hyderabad. Dr. Taruj, welcome to the call. Now I give Raju sir to introduce Dr. Dinesh Saralaya. Dr. Dinesh is from UK. Raju sir, please go ahead.
Dr. Dinesh Saralaya is currently a consultant respiratory physician, associate medical director at Bradford Teaching Hospitals in UK, and he's also the associate director for research at the Bradford Institute for Health Research. In 2006, he set up the severe asthma service in Bradford Teaching Hospitals. He has particular interest in inhalation profiles in patients with severe asthma and COPD. In 2009, he established the Respiratory Clinical Trials Unit at Bradford Research, which is one of the largest respiratory clinic trials units in the UK. In 2016, he was appointed a National Industry Lead for Respiratory Medicine at National Institute of Health Research, UK. Today, Dr. Saralaya is in the front line of the fight against COVID-19 in the UK and is leading the COVID trials across the United Kingdom, which has recruited over 130 hospitals and 2,000 patients, and he's collaborating with over 25 leading scientists to study and evaluate the results of those trials. To quote the medical director of Bradford Research, Professor John Wright, a medical doctor and epidemiologist, from a recent BBC report, it is the biggest and most urgent research race in living memory, and we are running for our lives. We are immensely grateful to Dr. Dinesh Saralaya for making time from his life-saving work day in and day out, and it gives me great pleasure on behalf of all of you to thank him and welcome him to today's urgent conversation. Welcome, Dr. Saralaya.
Thank you, Raju Rajgopalji. Now, without much waiting, I invite Dr. Taruj Ali to speak for 15 to 20 minutes on the latest, what's going on in US, what's the current status, what's the advances, and what are the positives and negatives so far in dealing with the COVID patients. Dr. Taruj Ali.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jamil, for that introduction. I've known Jamil for more than 30 years, and we had never thought that we would be collaborating in under a pandemic situation. But we are all facing this historic situation and trying to make the most of it. I'm trying to share my screen. Do you guys see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Jamil. And I just wanted to mention that Jamil has already been taking care of COVID-19 patients as well. So he's also a frontline person in this fight. And so are everyone who's in the healthcare field, whether it be doctors, nurses, first responders, respiratory therapists, and everyone. And I thank everyone for that. So I'll try to cover some of the things that I think are important, both from a public perspective and also from the healthcare perspective. Obviously, this is a very vast topic, and each of these subsets of topics can take 30 minutes or 40 minutes to go, but I'll try to be concise and try to give you kind of like a crash course in this pandemic in the next 20 minutes or so. So what I'll try to cover is some of the basics, what's happening in the US. We'll talk about the symptoms of this disease and what are the current treatment options and what the future might hold. So just some basics, because I know we have both medical and non-medical people on the call. So COVID-19 is the name of this disease. SARS-CoV-2 is the name of this coronavirus. This is a novel coronavirus, which means that it's a new virus. What are coronaviruses? These are a wide variety of RNA viruses, and they cause diseases varying from the common cold to SARS to MERS, and now COVID-19. The first case was reported in Hubei province of China in November 2019. And now, as you all know, we have cases in almost every country. As of yesterday, worldwide, there were about 2.23 million cases and about 153,000 deaths across the world. USA, unfortunately, has been really hard hit, and we actually have the most number of cases, 700,000 cases, and now also, unfortunately, 36,000 deaths as of yesterday, and I think today it's over 37,000 deaths. So just going back to a little bit of the history, how did this start? There's several theories, but the one that is the most relevant seems to be that this virus originated in bats. And there's also theories that there was a secondary or an intermediate host, which was the pangolin. And then subsequently this infected a human being, and then since then has been spread among humans. There's also a theory that it came from snakes, and there's also some other conspiracy theories that this might actually be a biological weapon. We're not going to indulge in those today. So why is it spreading so fast? Number one, no one has immunity to this because it's a new virus. Number two, there is no vaccine. It is probably a little bit more contagious than the flu virus. There is no known effective treatment. We're going to talk about a lot of treatment options, but I want to tell you that nothing has been proven beyond doubt to be effective at this point. Initially, this virus was reported only in people who had traveled to an affected area or came in contact with an infected person. But unfortunately now, there is a community spread of this virus, which makes it even more dangerous. So if you go to the WHO website, there's several graphs that basically trace the spread of this disease. And I've just chosen a few maps. So going back to January 23rd, this is a map taken straight from the WHO website. As you can see, the disease was predominantly in China. Most of the cases were in Hubei province of China and some other areas in China. There were a few cases in Korea, some in Japan, some in Thailand. And on January 23rd, there was just one case in the United States of America in Washington state. Moving on to just 2 days from there, it had already spread to several other countries. You had cases in Australia, in Singapore. There were 2 or 3 cases in France, and the United States had 2 cases. So this was January 25th. Fast forward to just yesterday. As you can see, this map again is from WHO, and it shows that every country in the world is now affected, and there are hundreds of thousands of cases in places like USA. This is another chart that I found very helpful, and it takes you through the spread of this disease. I'm just going to play this real quick. As you can see, this starts from January. All the cases that were in China from January into February, then you see the cruise line Diamond Princess, second, that had about 600 cases. And then suddenly you see other countries appearing, South Korea, and then it spread to Europe. Italy and Spain were affected heavily. Iran was affected heavily. And then by late March, USA was the most affected country. And from late March into April, as you can see, this chart goes up to April 14th. The country most affected has been USA, unfortunately. So next, we're going to talk about why has the US been so badly affected. And here, it might get a little bit political, but I'm not gonna, get into the politics of it. I'll try to keep it scientific. And these are my impressions. I think we can break down the causes of why it has badly affected the US into 2. Number one is administrative failures. I think this was a pretty big intelligence failure on part of the US intelligence, and also communication between the intelligence and the administration. It had to do with the administration's denial of facts. There were several intelligence briefings that had actually talked about this early in December and in January, and the government and the administration was in denial. There was a lot of negligence. A lot of warnings were not listened to. And then there were also shortcomings from the WHO, which was not reporting cases from China in a timely manner. China, of course, has its own issues with being an autocratic government and having secrecy, and they had botched their data, which again made this pandemic much worse than it should have been. And of course, in the USA, while we value our civil liberties and freedom, and we should, The way China was able to control this, unfortunately, because of their autocratic nature, they were able to completely clamp down the Hubei province, and it was completely shut down in a draconian manner for weeks on end. But they were able to control the pandemic. I'm not proposing we do any of that, but that plays into it as well. Then on the healthcare and health policy front, we had several shortcomings. Number one was testing. For weeks since the pandemic started, we didn't have adequate testing. The FDA shares blame for that. Initially they tried to control all the testing at the FDA level. They were not allowing private companies to do the testing, but then they changed their stance, but we lost a lot of valuable time while doing that. We have not been successful in isolating patients, and source tracking of affected people was something we're severely lacking in, and slowly we're getting better. I believe there was a delay in social distancing and shutdown. We could have done it sooner. And of course, you've all heard of shortage in PPE and protective equipment for doctors, nurses, respiratory therapists, first responders, and everything. There has been a lack of uniform guidelines from the government and administration. And the various states have their own standards, which again has resulted in the spread of this pandemic. So let's start and talk about the disease itself. How does it spread? How does one get infected? So it's basically a droplet infection. What that means is the respiratory secretions from a patient who's infected will infect another person. That can happen if you cough, if you sneeze, even with breathing. If you're in close contact with another person, then you can transmit this virus. So it's said that you should try to maintain at least a 6 feet distance to prevent spread of this virus. What are some of the measures that you can take? You've heard all about this: washing your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, using hand sanitizers, using tissues if you're coughing or sneezing, avoiding touching your face. And then more recently, as you have seen in the media, there's a push towards usage of masks, not only in the healthcare field, but also in public spaces. And you'll be seeing more and more of that. So this is a graph that many of you must have already seen, and you must have heard of social distancing. And we know that it works from past pandemic. The last big pandemic that we had was in 1918 with the Spanish flu. And as you can see in this graph, this is the response of two different cities and how social distancing helped in the case of St. Louis. If you look at the graph from Philadelphia, the first case in Philadelphia was reported on September 17th, and they did not implement social distancing since till October 3rd. As a result of that, there was a big spike in the number of cases in Philadelphia. On the other hand, in St. Louis, the first case was reported on October 5th, and they enacted social distancing right on October 7th, within 2 days. And as you can see, there was a flattening of the curve, and cases did not get that bad in St. Louis. This is another graph that you might have seen. When we talk about flattening the curve, this is what we're talking about. With social distancing, what we have done is we have prevented this peak. And in some future slides, I'll show you how the numbers have changed in the US. By social distancing, when you flatten this curve, the healthcare resources of the country don't get overwhelmed, and patients are able to get the care that they need, and that affects morbidity and mortality. So what was the worst case scenario in the US? If we had not implemented social distancing, what would have happened? So in the US, when this pandemic started, we had about 925 total hospital beds. Considering that we get about 30 million cases of flu every year, now this virus, since it's new and doesn't have a vaccine and is as contagious as the flu, you could expect that we could have had up to 30 million cases of coronavirus. Based on data from Iran and China and Italy and Spain, we know that about 6 million of those people infected might have required hospitalization. And about 1.2 million of those might have required ICU level care. When this pandemic started, we only had about 95,000 ICU beds. Now, data from China, Italy, and Iran has shown about 3 to 4% mortality. If you extrapolate that mortality, we could have expected about 1 to 1.2 million deaths from this pandemic. Even if the mortality was just 1%, which seems more realistic, we could have had about 300,000 deaths. But we have done a significant amount of good since we implemented social distancing. So these are the revised projections. This graph was actually shown by the White House in the third week of March in a press conference. And even by their assumptions, if we had not implemented social distancing, we could have seen up to 1.5 million to 2.2 million deaths. Since implementing social distancing in March, in the third week of March, they were projecting about 100 to 240,000 deaths from this pandemic. We have done really well with social distancing since then. Several states have been at the forefront, and the latest projections have now been downgraded to 60,000 to 80,000 deaths, maybe by July or August, which is a big improvement from what we had initially projected. And what that means is that our efforts are working. So I'm going to move on quickly to symptoms of COVID-19. Again, I know we have both medical and non-medical people, so some of this might seem very basic to the medical field people, but I think it's very helpful. So if you look at this graph, common symptoms: fever, 87%, dry cough, 67%, fatigue, sputum production, shortness of breath, muscle pain or joint pain, sore throat, headache, chills, nausea, vomiting, nasal congestion, and even diarrhea. Some patients can present with GI symptoms. As you can see, about 10 to 15% of patients will have no symptoms. So you can be asymptomatic and still have COVID-19 in about 10 to 15% of the cases. Moving on to diagnosis. How do you diagnose? Testing is done with a nasopharyngeal swab, where you have this special swab, which looks like a long Q-tip. It's basically inserted through your nostril, and they go through the base of your nasopharynx to the back of your nasopharynx till they reach the total back of your nasopharynx, and they take a swab from there. This is sent to the lab. Initially in the US, the testing was only being done by a few labs, and when we started, test results were taking 5 to 6 days. Then it went up to like 10 or 12 days at one point. But now we have rapid tests, and I believe there are tests that are getting results within 4 or 5 hours. There's also a test approved by FDA that actually gets results within an hour. But the availability of that test still remains limited. The second way of diagnosing this is testing for the antibody. So when you get this virus, your body actually makes antibodies. And if you've been infected, we can check for that antibody. And what that will show, and you might have heard this in the media, there's a push for antibody testing. This shows if you have already been infected by the virus. There's two types of antibodies, IgM and IgG. IgM represents immediate immunity. It means that you've been recently exposed to the virus. You might still be infected with the virus. This appears within 3 to 5 days. And then IgG is a longer antibody that suggests that you've been exposed or you suffered the infection several weeks ago. Whether this represents immunity, whether if you have the antibody you won't get COVID again, it remains unclear. It's likely that you have some immunity, but we're not sure yet. So what happens when you have severe COVID-19 disease? This can progress to pneumonia, which is an infection of the lung because it enters through the airways and it affects the lungs. When it gets worse, you can have respiratory failure. You can develop acute respiratory distress syndrome where your lungs basically stop working and they become fibrous. This is when you would require a ventilator. You can get secondary bacterial infection. From that, you can get sepsis, septic shock, cardiomyopathy, heart failure. There's also evidence to show that you develop coagulation problems. You can get clots throughout the body. And there's a condition called DIC, where you get clots as well as bleeding. You can develop renal failure, and that's when you require dialysis. And subsequently, you can have multi-system organ failure and finally death. So who are being affected most by this virus? As you can see, there seems to be that the older you are, the more likely it is that you might get a severe infection and the more likelihood that you might need to be in the hospital. This graph shows that in people who are 85 and over, 17.2 of every 100,000 population will require hospitalization. Similarly, 75 to 84 age group is 15.8, 65 to 74, 12.2, 50 to 64 is 7.4, and so on. Very little hospital admission in pediatric population. If you have comorbidities, then you can have a higher risk of mortality. What are those comorbidities? If you have cardiovascular disease, there's a 13.2% chance of mortality. If you have diabetes, 9.2%, high blood pressure, 8.4%, chronic respiratory disease, 8%, cancer, 7.6% mortality. So the more comorbid conditions you have, the more likely it is that you might succumb to this infection. Another one that's not shown in this graph is obesity. There's data to show that the higher your BMI, the more likely you are to end up in the hospital and then require ICU care. So treatment, of course, there's a lot to cover here. I'm going to try to be very brief and fast, and try to stay within the time frame. What I've done here is I've broken down several treatment options, and I want everyone to realize that while we have several remedies that we're trying, there still isn't enough data for us to say with 100% confidence what works for COVID-19. So when you talk about treatment, depending on the severity of the disease and depending on where the patient is, you can try to treat it at home for mild cases. Some patients are in the nursing home or SNF, and if they're not that sick, you could try to treat them there. If you get sicker, then you end up in the hospital. You could be treated on a medical floor if you're not severely sick. If you get severely sick, then you move to the ICU. And now, of course, in many places like New York, where there's a shortage of hospital beds, we have set up several field hospitals. A lot of convention centers have been turned into makeshift hospitals. There's also the Navy ship that is basically a hospital on the water that's being used for COVID-19 patients. Then talking about treatment itself, we can break it down into medications, adjunctive treatments, supportive treatments, and others. So I'm going to talk really quickly about what are all the medications that we are using for this disease and what is the evidence behind this. Of course, I can't cover everything, so I'm going to be this is a very brief overview. Number one, and you might have heard of this a lot in the news as well, hydroxychloroquine plus azithromycin combination. Hydroxychloroquine is an anti-malarial, and it has shown benefit in COVID-19 patients in combination with azithromycin. Right now, it's recommended for moderate to severe disease, typically in people who have respiratory symptoms. The dosage, the indications and all that, we can get into that later, maybe in the question and answer session. Remdesivir is an antiviral that had shown benefit with SARS and MERS, and there is a trial right now going on with Gilead, who's the manufacturer of remdesivir, and there are several hospitals in the US that are taking part in that trial. Just to mention, the hydroxychloroquine azithromycin efficacy is based on a very small trial that came out of France that only had about 25 patients, so the data is very limited, but it does help and it's being used. Some antiretroviral medication, meaning medication that were used for HIV, namely lopinavir and ritonavir combination called Kaletra in the US, is being used. Arbidol is another medication that's being used. Ivermectin is an anti-parasite that has shown to slow down RNA replication of this virus. And then there's others antivirals, Prescobix, Indinavir, and Ribavirin. These are some of them are anti-protease, some are antivirals. Another treatment that has shown a lot of benefit, and I want to mention this one, is anti-IL-6. So when this virus gets into the body, one of the responses that the virus induces in your body is a cytokine storm. And there is a very significant inflammatory response that affects your lungs and then subsequently affects multiple organs in the body. And one of the mediators of that immune response is interleukin 6. If your interleukin 6 levels are elevated, that indicates this response. And there's a class of medications called anti-IL-6, of which tocilizumab and sarilumab are two of the medications. These are used for treatment of conditions like rheumatoid arthritis and lupus and certain cancers. And there is evidence to show that if you give these medicines when the patients are entering into this cytokine storm, there is a benefit. We actually have used it here in Richmond in a few patients with a lot of success. But again, I want to caution that we need more studies for all these treatments. This graph just shows the various mechanisms of these medications again, where they work in the cascade and what's the mechanism of action. I can share this with anyone who wants to get into more details. What are some of the adjunctive therapies? So when patients have respiratory failure and have difficulty getting enough oxygen into their body, some of the things that we have tried are prone positioning. What that means is you place the patient on their stomach instead of on their back. You're flipping them, you're putting them on their stomach. Most of your lung is towards the back, so by changing their position, you improve the oxygenation and the oxygen exchange. Another treatment that's being tried is inhaled nitric oxide. This has shown benefit in people with pulmonary hypertension in the past and in people with respiratory failure and ARDS. It improves oxygenation to the lung. It also causes vasodilation in the pulmonary blood vessels, and that has shown some benefit. Then there are therapies like vitamin C. There were studies with vitamin C in severe sepsis, given in very high doses, and that has also shown some benefit in COVID-19. Zinc, again in high levels, also helps slow down the growth of the virus. Steroids, corticosteroids are being used in people with severe disease, with ARDS and sepsis. Again, the evidence is equivocal depending on what papers you look at. Statins have been used. Statins have shown to have an anti-inflammatory effect, and you might see this being used in patients. And then you have plasma transfusion. So some people who have been affected by the virus, they develop antibodies in their blood, and that blood or that plasma with antibodies can be used and it can be given to patients who either have the disease or as a preventative measure to prevent infection in normal people. Then I've added a few things on the side. Antibiotics will be used to treat infection because you get super infection in these patients. Anticoagulation, like we talked about, a lot of people who have severe disease are developing clots all over the body, so anticoagulants are used. And then lastly, ECMO, or extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. This is where the patient's heart and lungs are so diseased that they're not able to do the oxygen exchange. So you temporarily place the patient on, essentially, in simple terms, I would call it a heart-lung machine, where an external machine is doing the function of the heart and lungs while the patient's heart and lungs recover. That has been used in extreme situations. What does the future hold? Coronavirus vaccine. So conventional vaccines take about 6 to 10 years to develop. We now have a vaccine that is an mRNA vaccine. So this vaccine is slightly different than conventional vaccines, and that's why it's being developed faster. It doesn't have the virus particles, but what they're actually doing is they're using the messenger RNA from the virus. The first phase of the trial already started in March, and this will have 3 phases. From my experience, my estimates, I think it'll take at least 8 to 12 months even for this vaccine, and then we'll have to see how effective that is. Lastly, what will the future look like? Is the worst over? According to many scientists, we might have seen the peak of cases, especially in the US this past week. So hopefully we're over the peak. But the other big question is, will there be another surge? So the big question right now is, do we stop social distancing? Do we stop all the shutdowns and the lockdowns that we have in place? We have to be very cautious. It can't be an on and off switch. What I think we have to do is we have to do it very gradually. So we have to be very smart on how we're going to do this. And if we see any indication that we're going in the wrong direction, we should be able to dial it down pretty fast. Will the world be a different place after this pandemic? I think in a lot of ways it might be. Will be how long before we go back to like a big concert or a big sporting event? Will we feel comfortable going there? Will there be handshaking anymore? will we be going to restaurants and movies in the near future? It might take a while before we get there. How do we prevent future pandemics? I think one of the key things which I take from this, from SARS, from MERS to now COVID-19 is these viruses originated in animals and came into humans. And there is a big market out there for exotic animals called wet markets. And there needs to be an international effort to really clamp down on these wet markets so we can prevent future pandemics. And then, of course, there has to be a lot of collaboration with different countries and WHO to also slow down the progress of these pandemics in a very timely manner to prevent their spread from one country to another. And then, of course, there are a lot of unknowns. I know that was a lot of information. I tried to pack a lot into 20 minutes. If you have any questions, I'm sure we'll have a question and answer session in the end. Once again, I thank everyone for this, and let's move on to the next speaker. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Taruj, for your excellent presentation. Now, Dr. Dinesh Saralaya, please unmute your mic and please take over. Dr. Dinesh Saralaya from UK.
Thank you so much for the organization of this webinar, and thank you for inviting me on this panel. I'm not going to be giving a presentation as Taruj, and I think he has alluded to most of the facts of the background of the illness. I'd like to give a UK perspective and how we're going to combat this deadly disease. In a way, as scientists, and I call myself only a part-time clinician because I spend most of my time researching, and within a month I've become a severe asthma researcher converted into a COVID researcher. And the circumstances have made me do so just for the greater health of our communities, really. Now, from a UK perspective, we are a much smaller country than the US. The advantage we have is, you should have heard Prime Minister Boris Johnson last week commending the NHS. And if this is one of the jewels of our country, and I have come from India, trained in this country, the single important wealth of this country is a unified healthcare system, which is not seen in any other part of the world than the UK. The single health research arm of the NHS, what we call NIHR, National Institute for Health Research. And I consider myself a great privilege to be part of that. Now, the UK is a much smaller population. We are a population of 65 million. And we had our first case around early February, but the real surge in cases, especially in London, which is our largest metropolis, started around early March. I practice in a city called Bradford, in the county of Yorkshire. If you were to draw a map of the United Kingdom, I'm right in the center. So we are in this so-called industrial belt, which has Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds, Bradford, and Hull. So right in the center of the UK, and we had our first case in my hospital, which serves a catchment area of 500,000, has about 950 beds within our organization, with phase 1, which Taruj will know. We have a phase 1 research facility, which I head. And we saw first Covid-19 patient who was a traveler from Tenerife on the 16th of March 2020. And within 2 weeks, on the 30th of March 2020, the rapidity of spread was such that we had 80 positive patients and 16 patients on a ventilator in our intensive care unit. We had 2 intensive care units full of patients who had no other option, as Taruj mentioned, to end up on a ventilator. We've learned some early lessons from our neighbors in Italy, and the nature of this illness, as Taruj has quite eloquently put, is that it progresses very fast. And what I would call is 2 rules in this illness. As a doctor looking after this patient, I think there's an 80-20 rule. And what is this 80-20 rule? 80% of patients who catch the infection will get better. 20% will come to some form of harm. And out of those 20%, 15% will leave hospital unharmed, I should say. And about 5% will end up on a ventilator. So if you take 100 patients, 5% of them really come to harm. We are about 20, of that 20%, 15 we really get better and they get home. It's only a matter of time. And from having treated this illness, and I'm sure my clinical colleagues who've seen this illness will agree, it seems to behave its own, deciding what it does in individual patients. And part of that I will touch upon briefly on the signs of the disease. The disease, as we went into lockdown in this country on the 23rd of March, so we've just extended our 3-week lockdown to a second, third week. And as Taruj quite rightly said, we are seeing a downturn in cases. We had prepared 4 intensive care units with a total of 100 ventilator beds, 100 non-invasive ventilator beds, you must have seen various television channels projecting a mask on a patient's face. We call that continuous positive airway pressure, and high flow oxygen. And one thing which Taruj did highlight, what we found within our real estate, within our hospitals, is across London, and one of the reasons why they're building these field hospitals, which is because the existing infrastructure cannot cope with the volume of oxygen that is being used on these patients. So what we realized is in our own hospital, on a ward which was built in 2019, we cannot accommodate more than 10 patients on high flow oxygen because the system, and it's something like a gas pipe or a water pipe, it has to take a flow rate of about 360 liters a minute to deliver about 30 patients on high flow oxygen or ventilators. What we realized is our hospitals were not built for that because nobody anticipated this pandemic. And one of the reasons why I think countries are moving to this field hospital model, and if you probe very closely why China built a hospital in a week, they found quickly that their hospital facilities were not able to cope the oxygen demand. It's not that there was a problem with the supply of oxygen, but actually the oxygen reaching the patient. And we found that very quickly in our establishments. And almost every big city in the UK has developed what we call, like you call field hospitals, we call them Nightingale hospitals. So one of the big convention centers in London called the Excel Center has been developed into a 2,000-bedded Nightingale hospital with brand new piping with 4 super tankers of oxygen, which is supplied by British Oxygen Company. And similarly, in every part of the country, in big cities, these Nightingale hospitals with at least 1,000 beds have developed. Fortunately, we have not had the need to use them as yet, except for in London. So including my area, we have a small town called Harrogate, and we decided we would build our Nightingale hospital there with 1,000 ventilated beds. By which I mean, I should use the word ventilating very carefully here, because we like not to ventilate these patients, because I think, in my own opinion, and this is the opinion of many colleagues in my specialty, if you put an endotracheal tube, as you will see, a tube into one's airway to support the breathing, that almost serves as a death knell to these patients. And one of the early things that we realized from both Italy, France, Spain, was that these patients should be, as much as possible, not ventilated. By which I mean either they're managed with careful oxygenation, as well as using a non-invasive ventilation, we call it NIV or CPAP. And the Italians were particularly, I have to thank them, and the World Health Community needs to thank the Italians for their insight into how they treated the illness. Because as you know, nothing much came out of China. China alerted the world only just before the new year. And by the time we had the epidemic, before it was a pandemic spreading to Italy, the Italians, and that's why I have to commend many of my Italian medical colleagues, spread the word around, please do not ventilate these patients early. And they said to prolong invasive ventilation as much as possible. And that comes to the point that Taruj made about prone ventilation. Prone ventilation is what we call in our country tummy time. Tummy time is the patient lying on his stomach. And we rotate the patient in intervals of 20 to 30 minutes, either to the right, the left, the front, and the back, and keep them with either non-invasive ventilator support or oxygen support. So we've realized very quickly the lessons that our neighbors had to endure because they were the first in this pandemic, the first wave. So in a way, the UK has had a bit of a head start and has planned, I must say, very well. In a way that we planned our capacity very well from the beginning, and the unifying factor of our healthcare system, which we we did immediately was we shut down all the private hospitals and converted them into national health facilities. So as of now, in the UK, there is no private healthcare existent. Every small private hospital has been converted into a national health facility. So that again must commend the UK government for acting so swiftly. And today we've got a surplus of beds within our country that we're not using. So we've now suddenly realized the other way, that there are lots of patients with non-COVID illness coming to harm. And that is a separate issue outside this webinar. Now, coming back to the science, I think Taruj made a very important point about this cytotoxic storm. And I'd like to make a very simple, because I do know that a lot of non-medical people in this webinar. Again, I would give a rule of 15 thumb there. A rule of 15 is that -3 to 0 is the exposure to the virus, 1 to 7 is the asymptomatic phase, 7 to the 12 is your danger phase, and maybe 12 to 18 or 21 is your recovery. Now, what we see in that vital 7 to 10 or 12 days is this so-called individual variations in one's innate immunity. What do I mean by that? The ability of us to fight viruses depends upon certain defense mechanisms within our airways. And one of them was very nicely alluded by Taruj in his slide, is the various receptors that occur within our airways. And what this virus seems to do is attack that very defense within our lung. So we have numerous hair-like structures within the lining of our airways called cilia, and these seem to be affected almost immediately with an implantation of the virus into the epithelium, almost causing the epithelium to be so vulnerable to the other infections that it becomes vulnerable to. So what we are seeing is then this body trying to fight this infection, but doing it in a very abnormal way. Abnormal in the way that each one of us are variable, and we've not come to any firm conclusion of who these individuals are. We're trying to phenotype them. I've been involved in a project to try and phenotype these patients. And one of the earliest conclusions is that patients from Black and ethnic minorities, and Taruj again very eloquently put it in a slide, with high body mass indexes, with hypertension and diabetes coming to harm. We found that 1 in 6 patients on a ventilator belong to Black and ethnic minorities. And the same is very true from some of the information that was shared from New York City. The New York City had a disproportionate, very high amount of people from the African Caribbean descent. So we found that very early. In our own population, we found that some of these Black ethnic minorities, due to variations in their healthcare utilization, in the background deprivation that they may have poor health indices, which put them at greater risk. That is the current, as far as what we have looked at. There is no genetic reason why a Black or ethnic patient should come into any problems. Most of the healthcare professionals within our NHS who have come to harm, sadly, have belonged to people from the northern African parts, as well as some from Bangladesh. So we are trying to probe that. Now, the second part is, as Taruj mentioned, I have to make it very clear, there is no exit strategy for this illness. And I've been involved in reviewing more than 100 studies as part of our national group to look at what needs to be done to fight this illness. Unless we have a vaccine, which again is some time away, there is no exit strategy from this illness. So in the meantime, we set out very early in the UK from the Department of Health and the National Institute for Health Research to set up a committee, which I've been fortunate to be part of, and we call this committee the Urgent Public Health Badging Committee. And what we did was set up 3 platform studies. Rather than having complete chaos with multiple sponsors trying to do multiple studies, we said we're going to institute 3 platform studies. And what we mean by that is that would be catering to each of the 3 platforms. And we call these platforms, one in primary care, so in general practices. We call this study the principal study. The principal study is looking at 3 main arms in treating patients with COVID-19 illness in the community. And the 3 arms we used were standard of care. So you do your usual paracetamol, self-isolate, hydrate, and keep them at home. Hydroxychloroquine, and I will go through those doses. And the third one was a drug which, again, Taruj mentioned, was azithromycin. And the reason why we like azithromycin, and it's a personal favorite of mine because I've used it very widely in asthma and was part of the big study called the AMAZES study in asthma with the Peter Gibson group in Australia, which shows great evidence in non-eosinophilic asthma. So the macrolides of the azithromycin, where it belongs to, halt some of that interleukin-6 pathway Taruj mentioned, and certainly seem to have what we call as an immunomodulatory effect in COVID-19. So we call this study the principal study, and it's got over 20,000 recruits across primary care in this country. The next study was the hospitalized patients which come to my care on a respiratory ward or a pulmonologist's care. And these are patients who are prior to going on a ventilator. And we call this study the recovery study, and Raju, you did mention briefly about that, and I've been very heavily involved in coordinating that study. And to date, this study is the single largest world COVID-19 study to be coordinated from the University of Oxford. And the study, as of date, has recruited 5,300 patients into 5 arms. And those arms, it's a very adaptive study. So Taruj, who's taken part in trials, will know that we need to have people who are GCP trained, put on a delegation log, sign up their competencies before we could do a trial. Here, we did away with all that. We said that you had to read a training video, you get to sign a certificate of completion, and right, go, you were ready to consent. We were very fortunate in having our Prime Minister take part in the trial, who actually was a great advocate for the study. And to this date, we have got 5,300 patients as of yesterday, recruiting in about over 100 hospitals in the UK. Our own center has recruited close to 60 patients into the study. And the study has 5 arms. Standard of care is you continue what we're doing to the patient. Lopanavir and ritonavir, which Taruj mentioned, Kaletra is one of the arms. Hydroxychloroquine, azithromycin, and nebulized beta interferon and dexamethasone, which are one of 2 doses we found nebulized beta interferon difficult. So the third study, which is the third platform study, which is what we call the REMAP CAP study, and that is an intensive care study. And again, there are 3 arms in that: standard of care, hydroxychloroquine, and remdesivir, which Taruj mentioned. And we found great success with remdesivir, with up to about 65% of patients responding. Problem we've had is your president has been a bit reluctant in releasing some of that supply to Europe, but we found a sponsor in Basel, Switzerland, who could give that to us. So remdesivir, again, so these are the 3 platform studies. And what we've done is we've got, as Taruj mentioned, lots of commercial sponsors, and 2 of the sponsors are heavily involved in a vaccine development. And what the NIHR has done very, very proactively, and I should commend them again, is develop what we call patient recruitment centers. Because we know the only way we're going to develop a vaccine is recruit large number of patients and develop a registry now for prospective volunteers in phase 1. Because if you're doing a trial, as Taruj mentioned, it has 3 phases, 1, 2, and 3. And 1 is what is called healthy human volunteers, to see what the dynamics of the machine, the vaccine is safe. And we've already developed a registry in these studies, 5 big cities in the UK, to go on to any prospective vaccine study, which we presume will come to the UK in the first week of May. We then hope to go to phase 2 in July, and probably optimistically, if I'm always an optimist, we want to ensure that we are doing phase 3 studies from September, that we will be able to help the greater good of mankind to get over this disease. So as researchers in the UK, we have contributed all our resource into these 3 platform studies. But for individual pharma companies who want to do in the UK, we've got what is called patient recruitment centers. There are 2 big studies going on with pharma, one with hydroxychloroquine and another nebulized beta interferon in patients with COVID-19 illness with another company called Synergy. So there are 2 or 3 studies, and of course, there are, on an average, we get about 6 studies coming to the UK to be done, and we vet them very carefully. So I think this is the crucial phase of this illness. I think we are growing through what I call the most challenging phase of this pandemic. If we win this phase, we then lock down and take out the lockdown successfully, and do not see the peak, with Taruj mentioned, a second peak, and we see the continued flattening, and we are in a place to start some of the vaccine trials and develop robust, what we call testing and contact tracing. I think we will fight this probably from June, July onwards. And I hope with that optimistic note, I conclude my very small speech here, and happy to take any questions from the audience.
Thank you both. Thank you, Dr. Dinesh, for your excellent talk and insight into the UK. research trials ongoing, as well as the current update from UK. Thank you so much. I will open up the question and answer session. I invite Dr. Rehan to directly ask the question while I browse the WhatsApp questions and I'll put forth. So Dr. Rehan, you can unmute yourself and you can introduce yourself and ask your question, please.
Sure. For those of you who don't know, I'm Dr. Rehan Khan. I was director of orthopedics at Johns Hopkins University. Now I'm in private practice, running urgent care centers and my own practice. I have a question to both the speakers, but first question is to Dr. Tharooj, because it relates to United States. For a person with no medical background, the symptoms that they need to be looking for, when to call the PCP, when to go to an urgent care center, or when to go to an ER, or when to call 911. To make it simple for the common, because I have been seeing patients in urgent care center, and everybody who comes with a cough and a fever, they think that this is it, they have COVID and they need to go, or they need a COVID test. Although we have testing available, but still we need to be very conservative who needs to be tested. Can you go over in a little bit detail?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Rehan. I know that is a very difficult question, and we get patients calling us all the time. Like I mentioned, among the common symptoms, of course, is fever, cough, shortness of breath, and then you have a lot of atypical symptoms. You can have sputum production, fatigue. A lot of symptoms could be very similar to the flu. What I would recommend to patients is they should utilize all the facilities that are available now, especially with telemedicine. Most of the physicians that I know are now offering telemedicine appointments. So even if you have minor symptoms but you're concerned, I think you can contact your primary care physician, or if you see a respiratory physician or a pulmonologist, you can contact them and say, hey, listen, I have these symptoms. I just want to do a quick appointment with you through telemedicine. That way you don't expose yourself. You don't go to a clinic or a hospital. You're not exposing yourself. You're not exposing others. And your physician can hopefully, based on their assessment, tell you if you actually need to go to an urgent care, or do you need to go to a testing facility to get tested. Some of the other things that I've recommended, since I have a lot of pulmonary patients, is I've recommended my patients to buy a pulse oximeter. This is a little gadget that you can put on your finger, and you can check your oxygen level with that. It gives you your pulse and your oxygen level. And they're available in most of the pharmacies for between $25 to $50, maybe $80 at some places. So that's a very easy investment. You could do that. You can check your temperature, you can check your symptoms, you can check your oxygen level. But again, like you said, Dr. Rehan, we have to be careful in not utilizing our resources in a very irresponsible manner. Not everyone needs to be tested. Not everyone needs to go to the emergency room. But I think this is where we can utilize telemedicine to educate our patients.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, the next question is for the other speaker. There is no infection and death rate in India so far, thank God. Is there a link of BCG and COVID immunity? Could you elaborate? Being in England, you might have seen a lot of them, and especially people from India who had BCG shot. There was a report that there might be some immunity, that people who had BCG shots, and a lot of us did have it. Can you elaborate on that?
Thank you for that question. I think it's purely speculative at the moment. There seems to be some form of epidemiological link at the moment, nothing proven scientific by science. I would argue that a lot of these patients that we have seen, so for example, I can only go by the UK experience, BCG vaccination was mandatory till 2005 to all comers in the UK, irrespective of where you were born, whether you were from white heritage, Asian heritage, whether you came from abroad, and even the contact testing when you came into this country, if you didn't screen sensitivity for tubercle antigen, you would be given a BCG vaccination. Now, the population that has succumbed, and this is very interesting, It seems to be a lot of these patients who have had BCG. So I'm not entirely sure whether there is a larger proportion, and this is the pure facts about this illness is that a large proportion of these patients are not coming to medical attention because many of them are self-isolating at home. So to just extrapolate that with a small group of patients who we see, again, I come back to my 80-20 rule. 80% of the patients we're not seeing because they're isolating at home, they're getting better. And then this 20% we're seeing, it's hard to say. I think it's early days. There has been some interesting evidence to point towards that, but I myself am not aware of whether it has an advantage, and I don't want to give that false reassurance at this point. However, I can say that it's very interesting why the pediatrics group have not got it. And again, Tarun showed a slide where he demonstrated, if people paid attention, I wish we could bring it up, there was something he mentioned called an ACE receptor. We think that the children do not have this ACE receptor well developed. And this virus seems to like that receptor to bind on for that interlinkage initially to the airway epithelium. So what we're thinking very seriously among our research circles at the moment is to add an antihypertensive to people in the recovery arm to see whether it would have an effect. And I think coming back to BCG, there may be something to do with that as well. So at the moment, the answer to your question, I don't know really. It's early days. Maybe as the pandemic pans out and we know more about the disease, we'll know. Because we are in the process of collecting every single patient who's coming to our organization and studying the ethnic variations of what we're going to do. And we want to publish that in a large cohort of patients around the region to see what are the key learning points that we get from each of these patients.
Thank you. Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Dr. Dinesh. I have a question from one of our members, Josna Palwai, to Dr. Dinesh, and one question for Dr. Taruj. Josna Palwai is asking the question about the double-blind trials. How effective are those, and how do we know if the patient is treated by the medication and not because of his or her immunity to fight the virus? That's one part of the question. The second question, I guess it is addressed to Taruj. It says, what are the current pressures on the FDA for the drug evaluation process? If the safety and efficacy of these controlled trials are well established before the drug can be marketed. So these are two armed questions from Josna Palwai, our member from Indian Americans Forum. So please, Dr. Dinesh, go ahead.
So I can talk about, so in a setting of COVID-19, it is very difficult to do a randomized controlled blinded trial. The reason why, I'll tell you. Normally, clinical trials are carried out in a clinical research trial facility. These are almost always, unless it's a phase 1 trial where you do it within a phase 1 research unit, it's often people coming to a clinical trial facility where they get administered either the placebo or their IMP, which is the investigational medicinal product, or they get randomized again in a clinical trial facility. Here you have to be adaptive in your design. Here you're looking at a sick group of patients. They're often in a very, very isolated atmosphere with staff in full protective gear. So it's like literally those who have treated these patients. I've been in pulmonary medicine for 25 years. I've been practicing in the UK since 1995, and I've never come across this in my entire career. You know, I've seen a lot of patients die. I've treated ventilated patients. I run a large non-invasive ventilator facility in my organization. And yet, the way that you see these patients presenting with this unique spectrum of disease in full protective equipment and gear, and then wanting to do these study procedures very often involves complex interventions, like even an ECG becomes challenging in that, because you've got to strip the chest, you connect the leads and do the ECG. So the trials in this conducting an RCT poses its own challenge. So most of the RCTs are designed in a way that it's adaptive. So what do I mean by adaptive? So the recovery trial is a very adaptive trial in that it's, even though the randomization takes place remotely, so what happens is the moment I take consent from the patient, we then enter the patient's details into an online portal, and it gives a number which assigns them to the arm of the study. And what we then do is that arm of the study becomes one of the 5 arms I've already previously told you. And that medicine is then dispensed by the nurse looking after that patient, not by a clinical research nurse, because the timing is also crucial. Many of these, so I'll give you an example. Hydroxychloroquine, which is widely, must have interest to the whole group here. It's an anti-malarial drug. And the dose that we're using it in the trials are not your simple once a day dose. So the dose that we're using in recovery, and I'm not sure, Karuj, what the dose in America is. We use 800 milligrams as the starting dose. So that will be at 0.0. We give 800 milligrams 6 hours of the first dose, 400 milligrams of 12 hours of the first dose, and then 400 milligrams twice a day for 9 days. So that you can see the challenges of running a randomized. So when you have to then match. If you run a blinded trial, the placebo should follow the same dosing regime as the investigational drug. So it's so tough to do that. So what we're trying to do is what we call adaptive trials. Adaptive means adaptive to both the circumstances that we are in and adaptive to the needs of the patient. So the downside of that, coming back to your question, is we will need a larger sample size. So the sample size and the number calculation will be larger, because as you try and add more and more arms into the study, as we're currently doing, the sample size is going to increase. So we are pertaining for an interim analysis for the recovery study to probably take place after 18,000 subjects. So that is the size that we're looking at. We probably end up with close to at least 50,000 patients if the pandemic evolves in such a way, or we'll then close the data earlier on. With coming to drug disease, same with remdesivir as well. It has to be an adaptive study, and we have to learn from what these patients are responding for. Again, the duration of what these patients go on the trial varies. So it'll be interesting to see when we get the data on these studies.
Thank you. Taruj, any input on FDA pressures for approving?
Thank you, Dinesh, for that great explanation. I totally agree how difficult it is to run a RCT in a pandemic situation. And quickly to answer your question about the doses that we're using in the US, what we're doing is 400 milligrams twice a day on day 1, and then 200 milligrams twice a day for 4 days. This is not a research protocol, but this is what's being used in many of the hospitals. And of course, we'll see what the results are from various trials that are going on. The question about FDA, this is a situation which we have never faced in modern history, right? So there's a lot of, typically there's a lot of procedural hurdles that we have to go through an FDA trial. FDA, as you know, is probably one of the most restrictive and conservative when you look at the various healthcare controlling organizations in the world. But in this situation, they've actually relaxed a lot of their rules. There's a lot of medications that have been approved for expanded indication, medications that were used for other conditions. FDA has approved them based on whatever data we have now to be used for this indication. When a new medication comes out, that poses its complete new set of challenges, because this medication has never been tested. You have to start basically from square one, and it takes much longer. I guess the question was, how does FDA do this in a reliable way? Was that the question?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So we have to balance being overprotective and being very cognizant of the regulations versus the need of the hour, which is sort of emergent. So the FDA is doing this delicate balancing job of not giving up those protocols and the regulation that it needs to, but also being cognizant that there is a time crunch. We need to find things quickly, and they're trying to balance that. Of course, there's going to be some missteps along the way, but I think they're trying to do the best that they can. And all those challenges that Dinesh mentioned with RCTs in such a situation. RCT is kind of the gold standard for any new therapy, right? But you have a lot of restrictions in this situation. So let's see how this plays out.
Thank you, Taruj. The next question is from Manish Madan, who is one of our co-sponsors for this event. He is the head of the Global Indian Progressive Alliance. He says, Are there any studies for hydroxychloroquine to be effective against COVID-19 as of today? Because it looks like President Trump is advocating its use against the advice of the scientific community. In particular, the FDA is not approving that. So are there any reliable studies so far done with all the data points, particularly the PE and other statistical evidence in this trial to indicate that hydroxychloroquine is effective both for prophylaxis as well as treatment against COVID? I guess both of you can give a one-line input on this.
So yeah, I can give the UK perspective. So as I've said earlier, we decided very early in this pandemic that no experimental study will be dispensed as part of a treatment protocol. So today in the UK, if a drug has to be tried in the COVID-19 situation, it has to be part of a platform trial. If it is not accepted as part of a platform trial, it will not be given to any individual. So that's our stance. So we do not believe, we wiped out all the evidence which has come, because the sample size, as Taruj mentioned earlier, is very small. It's the power was very poor, the randomization and the blinding was very poor, and I think there is a great investigator bias in those studies. And I, as a scientist and a clinician, I do not believe that. So I would agree with the stance that taken by the UK, that we have decided not to approve any drug for the treatment of COVID-19 infection if it is not part of a clinical trial. So that's the answer to your question. So at the moment, if you want to access hydroxychloroquine in the UK, you have to be part of a trial. It is not being dispensed by a clinician. Same with azithromycin, same with remdesivir, same with lopanavir and ritonavir. It cannot be written on a drug chart if you're not participating in a trial. That's it. If you don't participate in a trial, you get what is standard of care, which is your usual antibiotics, oxygen, fluids, whatever. But to be accessing these novel therapies, you have to be part of a trial, and that's the stance we're taking.
Thank you, Dinesh. I think that is one of the biggest advantages you have with the NHS, right? Everything is standardized and you can control those. In the US, we still have various layers. You've got private practice, private insurances, and you have Medicare, Medicaid. So I would say here we have a little bit more freedom, whether that's good or bad, time will tell. So we have been using hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin, and we can write a prescription. But of course, everyone realizes that there's a shortage of these medications. So you have to have a confirmed diagnosis, and you have to have, moderate to severe disease to get these medications. When it initially started and when President Trump started promoting this in the news, a lot of prescriptions were written, like a lot of doctors wrote prescriptions, for their colleagues, for their nurse practitioners, for nurses, and then they had to clamp down on that. Now there's a regulation where the pharmacy actually cannot dispense hydroxychloroquine unless there is a diagnosis in the chart of COVID-19, which I think is the right way to do it. But unlike the UK, it does not necessarily have to be part of a research protocol. For remdesivir, there is a research protocol, and I believe most of the hospitals have to go through that and get that through Gilead. But for other medications, even for interleukin-6, anti-IL-6, we've been able to prescribe it even though it's regulated and the supply is low. To go back to what's the evidence for hydroxychloroquine, as Dinesh mentioned, the trials are very small. The one trial that has been cited from France only had like 25 or 26 patients. And what they looked at was the viral load in the nasopharyngeal secretion. So even the endpoint was, what was that? Just the viral load, not an outcome. So the evidence right now is very limited. And of course, you have to be very careful when using medications like hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin in patients with cardiac disease, because it can cause arrhythmias. We have to monitor something called the QT interval. If that is long, then you should not be using these medications. So we have to be very cautious when people look at something on the news and they think it's working and they want to take it. I've had some patients even wanting to take it as a preventative measure. Again, there's no strong evidence that it actually works as a preventative medication. There's some reports in the media about certain patients who had access to the medication that took it and they had cardiac complications from that. So we have to be careful.
if I can add just one point to what Taru just said, there's a very famous tweet, and this I think tells you everything about hydroxychloroquine. When hydroxychloroquine was mooted as a treatment in the UK, the president of the British Cardiological Society tweeted because a patient asked him, "What have I got to lose when I take hydroxychloroquine?" And his single tweet said, "Sinus rhythm." And what does, as Tarun said, there is a very high risk of developing abnormal cardiac rhythms and sudden death if you've got a pre-existing cardiac problem. To the extent that in our hydroxychloroquine trials, we've got an cardiologist to look at this interval, apart from what the machine is telling you, because I'll give you an interval, which is variable. And remember, these are a sick group of patients. I have to tell this again. The quality of the ECG is not that great. It's not like you and me having an ECG at home. These are patients moving, they're very restless, they've got oxygen strapped to their face. The quality of the tracing is not that good. So what I've done to make sure that my patients are safe, I've got a cardiologist to look at it very carefully before we randomize them. So hydroxychloroquine, just because POTUS thinks that this is a good drug, I think it needs a bit more science than that. And I think it's very, very important to pass that message to the community. We've got to wait before, we are still early. This is going to go on for, in my opinion, 3 to 6 months, where we'll see the true drop. And during that, a lot of things that we've done right, a lot of things that we've done wrong will come out in the wash. I personally think I've learned within 4 weeks of treating these patients, what I was doing 4 weeks ago to now is completely different. And Taruj will agree. In the first patient I saw, I was worried about giving him a lot of intravenous fluids because I was thinking, this guy is sounding as if he's got fluid overloaded in his lung. Am I going to kill him? Actually, giving fluid is beneficial because these patients are dying of kidney failure. So this disease is so unique. And I think we've got to really be careful before and that's why I think the UK approach is really right. To be part of a trial, get the consent of the patient. And this is what I tell my patients when I consent them. You're not only helping yourself, you're helping the next wave of patients coming with this disease, and almost everybody consent on that. And I think that's the way to go ahead, I think, with this.
Yeah, thank you both. Another question on the similar topic from Josna. She cites a trial in the swine flu epidemic where perimavir was used to treat some severely ill patients, but after retrospectively analyzing those randomized control trials, it found out that they had no benefit of perimavir. So she's asking the question, are there any guidelines both for HCQ and as well as antivirals for these trials, so that looking back retrospectively after all this is over may not be effective? So what are the guidelines? If briefly you can cite, that would be great. Dr. Dinesh.
I think that's an excellent question. I must say, whoever asked that question, I think you really questioned, put my intellect to the challenge here. I don't know the true answer to this. We have to go by our gut feeling to a certain extent. So we saw all the benefits from China, Italy, Spain, France, and we said, let's put them in a randomized controlled trial. We can't put them in a true RCT. Let's put them in an adaptive trial with various arms and look at head-to-head comparisons. And only time, and I agree with you completely, by the person asking the question, we will know at the end of this pandemic whether we did the right things. This is an unknown territory. Like I said before, when you see these group of patients, they are out of the ordinary, really. They behave so differently. The way they present is different. The way they deteriorate is different. The way they get better is different. And all phases of the disease, the induction phase, the actual progression phase, and the recovery phase seems to be so different. And I think only time will tell which of these therapies. Now, this is my personal favorite, and I have to put this on to the group. If there was a drug I would believe would work, I think the anti-IL-6 is my bet, and remdesivir. I think those are the two. And Gilead is a company which was nobody knew about it before this. Now they are going to be very much in demand. So Gilead, remdesivir, and the anti-IL-6 therapies there.
Yeah, I think I agree, Dinesh. at the end of this, we'll know for sure what works and what doesn't. Right now, we're kind of trying everything with some evidence, but we don't have clear-cut evidence. I'm a believer in anti-IL-6. I've seen it work in a few patients myself, my partners. I'm part of a pulmonary group that has almost 30 pulmonologists, so we've been using it a lot. Remdesivir, Gilead came out with some early results of that trial, which are promising. If you've been following the media, just in the past couple of days, the early results look promising. We'll see how this plays out. There might be something completely different that comes out. We don't know at this point.
So I had one more point, if I could make. So we've been running a trial on anti-IL-6, which is actually produced by Roche Genentech. So in a single center, and those in asthma circles will know of a very eminent professor called Professor Chris Breitling, who actually produced, the Leicester Group said, eosinophils, where they designed the concept of eosinophilic asthma. So I have a lot of respect for Chris, who works very closely with me. And Chris designed this trial of anti-IL-6 and COPD. And I've been fortunate to sit on the trial steering committee for that trial. But we've not had a single patient with COPD. These are FEV1s of less than 50%. This is very interesting, and we're going to produce that data, come to harm from COVID-19. So this is an open label study, standard of care plus IL-6 in COPD, and every patient received standard of care and the IL-6 arm, which they've now got unblinded because the study had to stop, never came to harm from COVID-19. So we've just made an urgent plea to continue on compassionate grounds the treatment of those group of patients, which would eventually succumb to the illness if they get it. So they're just there at the moment trying to convince the sponsor to continue it for that group. Small group of 50 patients, but yet significant.
Great.
So on the similar topic, I guess this question is for Dr. Taruj from Somaditya Kar. She says, does it help if any of us are using adalimumab, because you talked about same kind of medicine in one slide. I guess the question is whether the patients who are already on adalimumab, the antibody, I guess that gives protection from developing COVID, if I understood correctly.
Adalimumab, if I'm correct, that is Humira. It goes by the brand name Humira, which is a medication used sometimes for people with rheumatoid arthritis. I think the mechanism of action of Humira is a TNF alpha inhibitor, so slightly different than interleukin 6. I personally am not aware of this medication being used. Maybe Dinesh can add. To my knowledge, I don't think this drug has been used.
So Taruj, with your permission, I can add two concepts in rheumatologists. There's a lot of pathogenetic processes in this disease which resemble rheumatoid arthritis. Now, I'll tell you two of those concepts. One is there is something called JAK pathway, Janus kinase pathway. And basically what it means is there is an inflammatory pathway which is thought to be very, very active in rheumatoid arthritis. And there are at least 3 monoclonal antibodies which are in phase 3 trials. And they think that shutting down this JAK pathway does definitely halt the inflammatory cascade, what you're seeing, that cytokine storm in patients coming to harm. To that effect, trials have been proposed to do that in a selective group of patients who could come to harm. So we're just in the process of looking at that. Which specific, the other thing which we should bear in mind, there is another product, we think. So this is a bit technical for those who are not in the medical group part in this call. A lot of patients with COVID-19 have a particular depletion of a white cell count called lymphocytes. So we're seeing a lot of patients with what we call leukopenia, so low white cell count, and lymphopenia, lymphocyte count depletion. Now, when I talk to my pathologists and hematologists, it's not a true lymphopenia. It's basically the COVID virus is allowing an abnormal lymphocyte in the circulation, which is not counted by our conventional counters. So that is because there is a proliferation of a particular prokinetic in our body called granulocyte monocyte colony stimulating factor. And when the COVID virus attacks our body, they tend to pour these abnormal cells into the circulation, which contribute to this so-called cytokine storm, which was alluded earlier in the talk. Now, blocking that monoclonal expansion of these abnormal cells is another pathway being explored at the moment. So again, these are the two. So I think rheumatologists, coming back to your question of adalimumab, I'm not sure of the pathway to Humira, but certainly some of these cytokine, I always tell this, I hope you'll agree with me, Taruj. The rheumatologists are always 10 years ahead of pulmonologists. If you look at the way they've evolved into monoclonal antibody, and I've learned a lot from my rheumatology colleague, the way they look at their science is far ahead of any other specialty. And I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from rheumatologists. And I constantly ask the pathways. And in fact, when I reviewed those two abstracts, I consulted my rheumatologists. And the amount of knowledge they have on these pathways is enough. I think if there are two promising pathways, that would be it. I hope I've answered that question.
Yes, thank you. I guess the other question is from Ritu Shekhar.
There's some questions in the Zoom chat as well.
Yeah, so I'm reading that from the Zoom chat. Ritu Shekhar, I guess her question is, if the vaccine is developed, so is it mandatory for the entire population to have that vaccine to prevent future many epidemics? I guess the context is for the people, some portion of the population who do not, the parents who don't encourage vaccines to their kids. So if the vaccine is developed in the future, is it mandatory for the entire population to prevent future many epidemics? If that is the question I understood correctly.
I think, Dinesh, because the concept of herd immunity was talked about a lot in the UK, why don't you take this question?
It's a tough one. I've got to ask. I'm not a virologist or an immunologist, so I don't call myself an expert in vaccines. The way I understand with this particular virus, the immunoglobulin profile, with again Taruj very eloquently put in his presentation, he talked about two immunoglobulins, IgM and IgG. So IgM tells you that you've had a recent infection, and then in the long term you build up a certain form of antibody called immunoglobulin G, and to develop that antibody, what is this emerging from those cycles, from the virologists and the immunologists, is that this profile doesn't seem to be constant, which will then delay the development of a vaccine, which is so dare I say, this virus is slightly different to your conventional viruses that you would have seen till now. So I think this is a huge challenge to the development of a vaccine. The answer to your question, to prevent future, I think I would make it mandatory to vaccinate everybody, because you don't want to take that risk in future, because if that, it's something like smallpox, to be honest with you. You have to vaccinate everybody for smallpox to eradicate it. And today you don't vaccinate for smallpox. So there should be no exceptions to the rule. Everybody, if the vaccination is approved and it comes, it should be mandatory for everybody.
Thank you. I guess the other question is from Dilshad Diali. She's thanking for both of you for the excellent presentation. She has one question which probably you guys answered it, but to just modify a little bit of her question, she asking whether what is the biggest factor, if not TB vaccine, other factors which are playing a greater role as of now in the greater immunity in India?
So if I can answer that, I've been studying India very closely, and I think India has a lot of, and I've also shared that with my classmate Soumya, who's part of the score. India has a unique, I've only learned this. The Western countries are not very good at contact tracing. So I'll tell this. India has so much of experience in disaster management. It has experience with the plague outbreak. So those in the group are as ancient as me. In 1994, people may remember there was a plague outbreak in Surat. And India curtailed that plague outbreak in a single city without spreading to any other part of the country. Now, India has a good track record of finding, searching. I think the only thing impediment to that is they can ramp up testing and isolate. They would be in a very strong position. Again, coming to the size of the outbreak in India, it's early days. I think they are at least 4 weeks behind the West, and they've locked down quite early. So it'll be interesting to see how that pans on in such a big population. But I have my own feeling, partly because I'm Indian as well, is I have a lot of faith in the Indian system. I have watched it at close quarters. When I trained in India doing my post-graduation, I've seen TB being eradicated, being treated so effectively at home. The West does not have anything called domiciliary treatment. There's nothing, no? There's no concept of supervised treatment. There's no resource. So if you look like countries like the US, UK, Italy, France, there's nothing called contact tracing. For God's sake, there's no isolation wards here. Whereas most Indian hospitals have an isolation ward. We used to have it for rabies, we used to have it for tetanus, we used to have it. So that concept is already built into the system because there's so much of infection in that part of the world. Whereas here, infection is, when we see a patient, the biggest thing I had to tune when I came to the West was to get rid of that infection and think of autoimmune, something which the body is destroying. So infection, certainly the UK, US is slightly different. But that's what I think India will be in a strong position. And I hope that my intuition comes right.
I think I would just add that places like India, because of the large population of communicable diseases and infectious diseases and the history with TB, plague, we have a lot of experience taking care of that. Like Dinesh mentioned, when we were practicing there, we used to have TB wards, a whole ward of isolated patients with TB. That concept is not here because communicable diseases are not, until now, were not a big concern. But now we are in this pandemic situation where we're having to adapt and try to learn from experience from, countries like India. The other thing I think India has done well is the effectiveness of, some of the messaging that has come out in the lockdowns that has been implemented throughout the country. I know there's been some people who have not followed the rules, but by and large, there's been some uniformity in that, and at a very early stage of the pandemic, rather than waiting till it got worse. And that question of, is there an immunity from BCG vaccine? Is there an innate immunity among Indians? I think that remains to be seen. I think the difference in the temperature and the climate, that also has something to do with it. So there's a lot of unknowns, but I think hopefully it will not get as bad as here in the US.
So the other question is from Sunita Vishwanathji, who is one of the founder for Hindus for Human Rights. She has a couple of inbuilt questions here. So the first question, part A, will be, what are the ramifications if the US stops funding to WHO? And whether is India, US, or any country we have seen that the poor must be included in initial efforts to contain spread. To go on lockdown without preparing for how to care for and feed the poor seems like a disaster in the making for all of us. Can you comment this? It is from Sunita Vishwanath.
Hi, Sunita. As far as WHO funding, unfortunately, this is how our president operates. If you don't play along with him, he's going to cut funding. He's not going to cooperate with you. I'm hoping that this is a short-term, prank from our president, and hopefully sane minds will prevail and we will continue funding WHO. Having said that, there have been drawbacks. WHO could have done more. They could have been more forthcoming in the information. China could have been more forthcoming in their information. There are drawbacks, but I think holding funding is not the right way to do it. So I think time will tell what impact that has. Dinesh, you want to add something?
I don't have an answer for that. But I think governments reacted very differently, really. I think it was to hang the balance, as sometimes I follow these briefings of politicians, is between human lives and the cost of the economy. I think certainly the UK, we had resigned ourselves to losing a vast majority of people, because I think when the pandemic came to the UK, we were already 3 weeks behind Italy. We had entered, a lot of tourists had come back. They had brought the disease inside. And I think the closing down would not be effective at that, and they decided to promote this concept of so-called herd immunity. But when they started seeing the harm people were coming to in London, and again, London was our epicenter like New York. London is still our epicenter. I think that's when a decision was made. Again, the different thing to what I have to say, if you look at where the pandemic evolved, Wuhan, 13 million, it came to then Italy, the Lombardy, those who've been to the Lombardy region, it's one of the wealthiest regions in Italy. One of the most affluent people, the town of Bergamo, is considered to be in something like a Beverly Hills. It's Milan, very crowded. and then it came to Paris, and then to Madrid. So these big pockets, and then London, of course. Now, a lot of that was incoming travel, and then in the UK, it was spread around, and then it moved to West Midlands, and then we're seeing a petering off as the lockdown. So I think the governments were really stuck, and I think to single out India in that is unfair. I think every country has suffered. Here, up to 30% of people who were running businesses are now resorted to what we call universal credit. So they've lost their incomes completely, and some of the income is protected at 80%. And for developing economies like India, it's really tough to implement because you've got to balance the risk of human life. And to be honest with you, if the pandemic kicks in India, the human life could be lost, would be immense. I think they have to make that decision.
Thank you, Dr. Dinesh. One more question, I guess you guys already answered, but I'm going to put forth with a little modification from our own Raju Rajgopalji. He's asking whether there is a speculation or a wishful thinking that people in India may have more resistance compared to the other countries. Is that a wishful thinking, or is that something as innate and vaccination and other factors playing role, or something which is probably at the tip of the pyramid, or something which could explode?
So if I want, I can answer that to some extent. I think India is still behind the other countries. So I think only the next 3 weeks will tell how India pans out. If I'm right, when I looked at the last figures, India has still got less than 1,000 deaths, with over 14,000 tested positive. But that number is not a true reflection. So I'd like to try and compare that to what is happening in the UK. So UK has got about 120,000 positive patients. These were only tested. And we have about 14,000, just under 14,000 deaths. Now, we are not counting the deaths in the community. Now, the way a death certificate is issued is if the patient has a proven corona swab, they're classed as Covid19 on the death certificate. But there are lots of patients, as Taruj will tell you, and you may have seen, they don't test positive because your swab return rate is about 65%. There's been a lag turnaround time, isn't it? About 48 hours for most centers. Today we're coming up quickly to less than 6 hours. But there again, it's not a 100% foolproof test. So a lot of these patients who have not tested positive, the death certificate doesn't mirror that. So I think the true death will only be known when this all comes out and later on when an analysis is done. I think I don't believe the death rate in China was only 4,000 people. I think it's probably much higher than that. So I think for India, I think the next 3 to 4 weeks. And if it does the same good things that it's done with previous outbreaks, then it will come out as a. And I hope that is true.
Yeah, I think to go back to the question of some sort of innate immunity or immunity from BCG, I don't think we exactly know the answer. But I agree with Dinesh when he said that we actually don't know of people who might be dying from this disease, but were never tested or never diagnosed. And even if you test them, like he said, there's only a 65 to 70% sensitivity of this test, meaning you could miss about 30% of infections. We're actually repeating the test in patients who are high risk based on symptoms. We ask for 2 tests before we say that the patient doesn't have the disease. And true data will probably only come out of Western countries, which have a very well-developed reporting and monitoring system where every death is reported, the cause of every death is reported correctly. In India, if someone dies in the slums or in a small village, you might never get to know that. You might never test that patient for COVID. You might never even know that the patient had these symptoms. So I don't know how much we can rely on those numbers, not just in India, but also in China. I think, like you said, I think those numbers were botched to a large degree. So the true data on mortality and morbidity will most likely come from countries like US, UK, and other Western countries.
There is a question from Yasmin.
There's one more. Hold on, Dr. Rehan. I'm going in an order.
Sure.
So there is a question from Adnan Siddiqui.
Okay.
So I'm going through the chat room, Dr. Rehan. So please bear with me.
Sure.
What are the chances of recurrence? I guess once the COVID-19 patients recover. I guess the question is the test of cure. Dr. Taruj and Dr. Dinesh is asking whether we are doing that, or whether this is the second cycle of COVID-19 infection. Basically, whether are we promoting test of cure for patients to say that they recovered fully, or whether if it comes back positive even after 14 days of isolation, whether that is counted as a reinfection.
So I can take that question first. Coming back to your retesting at 14 days, we think some of that could be the dead virus that you're actually seeing on the swab. So you've got to be careful when you interpret that in the absence of symptoms. So again, I go back to the 3-week rule. I think 2 weeks is a bit early. I think you rendered less infectious at that time. But the recovery process is varied from individuals. So if you don't have symptoms, there's no point in, and if you're on the road to recovery, I don't see much reason in swabbing you again. Coming back to, I'll give you another example. This has to go only from my clinical experience, and I'm going to talk to. So a lot of these patients are coming back with recurrence of symptoms not related to COVID. I'll give you an example. 2 weeks ago, we treated a 24-year-old gentleman of Asian descent with COVID pneumonia and was treated with non-invasive ventilation. So those of you who have seen the news, Fox or whatever in the US, a mask on their face and it pumps air into them. Now, in normal health situations, it's very rare for me to treat a 24-year-old man with CPAP, right? Unless when this 24-year-old gets a pneumonia, he will tolerate the pneumonia very well, that he will not require an endotracheal tube or will not go to intensive care, he'll get better. He's fit and well, he's 24 years. But with COVID, he's ending up on a CPAP mask. Now, some of these tall people are getting some of the complications of pneumonia representing with either because they had got dehydrated, like I saw a man developing a clot in his leg, which then perpetuated to his lung, pulmonary embolism. There was another man who came to us, treated a week ago, discharged a week ago, came back, but he had a punctured lung because he probably had a bleb, which is basically a defect in the covering of the lung. With the response to CPAP, to second day after his illness, he developed some chest pain. He didn't take much notice of it. Came back 5 days later, and he had a complete collapse of the lung. So when you mean they're coming back with illness, it depends on what they're representing. So a lot of these patients are presenting with either what I call a complication, as we are beginning to understand the spectrum of the disease. And again, I go back to Taruj, he put a very nice slide on the complications. So people are presenting with what is called kidney impairment, acute kidney injury. They're presenting with a pulmonary embolism. They're presenting with breathlessness. So what our diktat to our other physician colleagues is, keep your mind open because there may be a coexisting illness which you're branding as COVID. So especially in the elderly population, that COVID illness has presented as, again, Taruj mentioned, myocarditis. They may be coming as a consequence of heart failure. So a lot of this representation we got to take on an individual basis and make sure that it's not the complication of either the COVID illness or a pre-existing condition which is now exacerbated due to a recent illness. We know that.
Can I interject, Dr. Dinesh, here to get your insight on the sensitivity and specificity of this test in UK?
So our sensitivity, as I said, for the swab, for a single swab is 65%. Specificity is in excess of 80%. So the way we are doing it here, we are doing far less testing than the US. I think we've just gone up to 10,000 tests a day here. So in my hospital, so I'm going to give you my perspective, 950-bedded hospital, admitted over 400 patients with COVID. We've done just over 800 tests. So that gives you how less we are testing. So I think, and you must remember, I had a phone call from one of my patients today saying that they've been unwell for 3 days and self-isolating. The whole family is unwell. So you're not getting a true picture of the illness. So again, it comes back. You're seeing all the patients presenting to an healthcare setting, but you're not seeing the patients who are getting self-isolating at home and getting better. Those are not counted in the numbers you see. So I think we need to be careful when we think of recurrence of illness. So my advice to my physician colleagues is treat each patient as an individual case and look out for the complications. So for example, 3 weeks ago, we were not giving blood thinners for these patients. Today, everybody is on anticoagulation, isn't it? So we are treating them with high-dose heparin, we're treating them with aspirin, because we know that the dehydration, the CPAP, and the illness makes them at high risk of developing thrombotic complications, that is toxic.
Thank you, Dr. Dinesh. This is a question from one of my colleagues, Dr. Yasmin Ansari. She's asking if, I guess the question, if I understood correctly, is what is going to happen to the people, particularly healthcare workers who are asymptomatic, but they are tested positive? What are your recommendations for those healthcare workers? I guess to add to that question, because I work in an urgent care, so a lot of police officers in US, I've been seeing them who are asymptomatic but came in contact and have some mild fever or cough, and if they test negative on the COVID test, what would be the guidelines? So I guess putting two questions together: healthcare workers who are asymptomatic and tested positive, what would be the guidelines? And for those police officers and frontline people who are at the front line, what would be the recommendation if the test comes back negative? Because they are...
Farooq, to take this is more relevant to your population.
Yes,
So what we're doing here.
Yeah, we can talk about US, and I think your recommendations will also depend on where you are. So if you look at places that were completely overwhelmed, places like Italy and Spain, in those situations, healthcare workers who tested positive, after a couple of days, they were actually asked to come back to work because they just didn't have the workforce. So you wear a mask, you wear a gown and everything, and you come back to work. In a place like US, I think we're not overstretched right now, and hopefully we won't be. So for someone who tests positive, again, I would say, 2 weeks of isolation, and then whether we retest them before they come back to the workforce is a question that is, I think, up to the individual. There are no guidelines that say that you need to retest them that I know of. I can give you an example of a colleague of mine, a pulmonologist who tested positive and ended up in the hospital for 2 days and did well with treatment and went back home. And what we did for him was, 2 weeks of self-isolation and staying at home. And then when he was better, didn't have any symptoms, didn't have any fever, he came back to work after 2 weeks. We did not retest him. Now he's going to have antibody testing done, and potentially he might become a plasma donor. But there are no recommendations that I know of that mandate that somebody should be retested. For Jamil's question, what do you do for first responders who have the symptoms but they test negative? If your clinical suspicion based on the symptoms is pretty high, I would highly recommend that you repeat that test because of the fact that the sensitivity is only 65 to 70%. And if the patient is sick enough to be in the hospital, we're actually sending 2 tests at the same time, preferably to 2 different labs. Again, there are no guidelines to this, but this is what we have done to be realistic and be practical. So if a patient is sick enough to be in the hospital with symptoms, we send off 2 tests to 2 different labs, and hopefully with those combined results, you can rule that out for sure. We've had many patients who initially tested negative, but continued to deteriorate. We tested them again, and they became positive. So now what we're doing is, we'll just send off 2 tests. If you're sick enough to be in the hospital, you're going to get those 2 tests. For an outpatient, I guess if 1 test is negative, but you have a strong suspicion, you could repeat it.
Thank you. I guess the questions from the chat room is over. I will open the floor for 10 minutes. But in the meanwhile, being in urgent care settings, seeing patients with COVID high risk, I've been watching the patients' behavioral attitudes as well, because they have a lot of information on the media. So I would ask a generic question for both of the speakers. What are the psychosocial factors and their impact on a patient in nowadays in the clinical setting? So I guess my question is whether depression and other psychosomatic disorders are setting in the context of COVID. If you guys can touch base in the meantime, I will open up the floor.
So I can ask, so I can give a UK perspective of this. Very interestingly, our emergency room visits attendances were dropped by 53%. So this was a statistic which was published during the course of the week. But very interesting, patients coming with excess alcohol or withdrawal from alcohol and domestic abuse has increased by 26%, which tells you all because of the lack of thing. What is also happening, it's very interesting, the crime rate has fallen by 28% in the UK, But there's a lot of what is called antisocial behavior when people try and violate the social distancing or the isolation or the lockdown and do things which are not normal. Now, with regards to the psychosocial, we saw three patterns of behavior. In the initial phases of the pandemic, we were seeing a lot of worried well patients coming to hospital. So these were patients who just had lost their smell, had a sore throat. They didn't need any oxygen support and it just needed a reassurance. Now, the danger of that, they were coming to hospital, probably spreading the infection away. And then we started getting a lot more healthcare professionals getting affected, particularly in the emergency department. So now what we've got what is called as a triage tent, where a full PPE nurse triages everybody who comes into the emergency room and allows them only if they need a medical problem. So the psychological, what is being seen there is a lot of these patients with very, very severe depression and people with anxiety who are being confirmed. Imagine the UK is a much more smaller place than the US. The homes here are much smaller. And imagine a single mother locked in a 2-bedroom flat with 3 children running a rampage. So we're seeing all of that manifest onto the visits due to the anxiety that the patients are facing. So this poses a challenge to the extent that today we are thinking of actually opening up parts of the hospital to non-COVID disease, probably on a 60-40 basis. 60 COVID, which we'll call the red area, and the other open a separate entrance to the hospital for the non-COVID admission.
I think that's a very important question, Jamil, that you asked. What is the psychosocial impact of this pandemic? And I think we're still in the early phases of seeing what the impact is going to be. You might actually start seeing more and more of that. Like Dinesh said, even in the US, you've seen an increase in domestic abuse and domestic violence. One positive side effect, if you want to call it, was I was reading a news article that said that in March, this was the only month in 10 or 20 years that there was no school shooting. So, there are some positive side effects. Gun violence has gone down. But I think the psychosocial impact, the financial impact will start showing, now and moving forward, because a lot of people have lost their jobs. Unemployment has gone up. Domestic violence has gone up because of the reasons that Dinesh mentioned. When the checks that are coming from the government, when they start running out, and if we're still in a state of lockdown, if people don't get their jobs back, you're going to see bigger and bigger psychosocial impact. And I think, the psychiatrists and the psychologists really have a very important role to play here in helping people out in this situation.
Thank you both, and I will open the floor. I know there are some physicians on this call. You guys can unmute yourself and ask questions. We have 10 more minutes, and then we will wrap up the call.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Just a generic question for everyone. Starting today in the state of Maryland, it has become mandatory to wear a mask or some kind of face covering when you are in public. How often, if they have somehow they get hold of the surgical mask and they keep using it, how often, how long can they use one mask to be effective and not carrying the germs?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question. Normally, in any normal situation, you don't want to reuse a mask, right? But these are extreme situations. People are using disposable masks. Some people are using homemade masks. In an ideal situation, yes, you don't want to reuse it. But I think in this situation, you're going to be stuck where, as long as you make sure that you're the only person using that mask, obviously don't share a mask, use it for yourself. And if you don't have any symptoms under these situations, I think you can probably reuse it. The other thing I want to mention is, by wearing a mask, I think what you're trying to do more importantly is if you're an asymptomatic carrier, you're trying to prevent you from infecting others. It does help you if someone else is infected from protecting yourself, but equally important or more important is that if you're an asymptomatic carrier, you're not spreading it to someone else.
There is a Facebook question for Taruj. People are asking if one person in the family has COVID positive, they are told in United States to get isolated for 14 days. And after a couple of days, if somebody else in the family get diagnosed with COVID positive, can these two live in isolation in the same room?
I mean, these are, I mean, if you're infected already, I mean, can you live in the same room? So this is a question that I don't think has a clear answer, because what is the risk of getting a higher viral load if you're around someone, who also has an infection? In the healthcare field, a lot of doctors and nurses were getting really sick. There is this concept that because they're exposed to so many people, they have a much higher viral load exposure and they're getting sicker. So in an ideal situation, I would say probably not. Still try to stay in separate rooms, especially if one person was infected, 2 weeks ago, the other person is infected, 1 week after that. So the period of isolation is going to vary. So I would say try to be in separate rooms. But again, these are a lot of unknowns.
Yes. Anybody else has any questions? Thank you. Jyotsna, you can unmute yourself if you have any questions.
Jamil, I have a question. This is Adnan, if you allow.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. So, are there any signs of permanent damage, any lasting effects for the people who are recovering completely from COVID-19?
I can take that, Tanuj, if you want. I've seen a couple. So the real lasting damage we are seeing is the slower recovery process of the mnemonic changes from the CT. So I have looked after 2 patients who have fortunately been extubated. So these are patients who have come off their ventilator, and both of those patients have needed what we call a tracheostomy. A tracheostomy is basically a tube in the throat to bypass the upper airway, so you can clear the secretions, you can ventilate them easier because you're bypassing a lot of dead space in the upper airway. So these 2 patients we have seen, one of them in their late 50s has had certain changes which we think will be permanent. But the other patient depends, I think, again, on the density and the sickness these patients have. So to end up on a ventilator, I guess you would be on the severity of the category. So this particular patient had not only lung failure, he did not have respiratory failure, he also needed support for his kidney. He needed what we call hemofiltration, because he went into his kidney shutdown as well. So those patients, I think we will know with time whether this is going to be some lasting effects. Certainly, physically, I've seen the patient, they're a lot weaker. They've lost a lot of weight. The cough is much weaker, and their strength of standing up, and they're going to need long rehabilitation. We're talking about at least 6 weeks before they can go home. To the extent we have now set up what we call as a COVID step-down ward, where these patients are being rehabilitated. So that's the UK experience. Very early, but there is a small subset. We must remember that those who end up on a ventilator, probably 8 out of 10 will probably not survive. Out of those 1 or 2 who survive the ventilator, there will be about 50% who go home very quickly, but there's a small proportion who will be left with some damage. But the ones who are treating on the ward without going to intensive care, I think they're almost going to make recovery. Again, we don't know, and Tanuj may be able to share what the UK practice is. So normally when somebody comes to hospital with a pneumonia, the normal practice is we repeat their X-ray in about 6 weeks or 3 months, at least 6 weeks, to ensure that the pneumonia is clear. The volume of such patients is so much that we don't have a way now. At the moment, we're asking their primary care physicians, their GPs to do it. And again, we've got to learn what happens to these patients in perhaps 3 months' time. I'll be most intrigued to hear and see whether there's any other similar experience in the US.
Yeah, thank you, Dinesh. Like you said, when you have pneumonia, you can get some scarring in the lung, and what the long-term effect of that is going to be depends on how severe the infection was, and you definitely could have long-term effects of that. ARDS, which is acute respiratory distress syndrome, from any cause, not just COVID, has a long-term morbidity, because it causes this permanent scarring within your lung. And lung is just one organ. Now, if you have your heart affected, if your kidneys are affected, if you end up on dialysis, if you have multi-system organ failure, of course, the recovery process is going to be much longer. So to answer your question, yes, there will be long-term effects. Some people will have them, some people won't. And what the impact is, time will only tell.
Okay,
yes.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Jyotsna, if you have any question, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Dinesh and Dr. Taroj. And Jamil, by you too, for convening this meeting. From Science for Society platform, we have been trying to educate and enlighten people, organizing these meetings a lot. My question is, and I read a lot about it, can this virus be created in lab? I mean, there is a lot of debate going on. I tried to answer many times, but I come from a non-medical background, so I would like to hear from medical people with medical background.
So is the question is whether this is a manufactured virus potential?
Can it actually be manufactured?
Hypothetically, I would say yes, but is there evidence that this is a biological weapon, or was this made by China or someone else? I really don't want to comment on that or indulge in those theories. I guess it's possible, but there is no evidence at this point.
I have a question about the incarcerated population. Has there been a rise, and is the British government letting them go? Because here in Maryland, people are asking that the people who are like seniors, ages 60 and above, and do not have major crimes should be released from the jail. So both of you can comment.
So I can give a British perspective. I think, yes, Britain, some of the people with less severe penalties were allowed out, partly because of the pressure of jails. Now, it's very interesting how the healthcare system will respond to somebody suddenly, if a high-risk prisoner is brought into hospital with COVID-19. We did explore that thing, and we created a separate intensive care unit as well as a ward for such people, which will be completely protected. We centralized those hospital settings rather than having it in all hospitals. So luckily, again, we are a smaller country, so I think it's very different configuration to the US. We designated one of our larger hospitals, and perceiving that there were a lot of releases, because what was the worrying thing is there was a lot of dropout of the prison officers falling sick and having to self-isolate. We lost a lot of those staff looking at prisons, and that was the worry initially. But I think we've not had any, certainly I've not come across anybody who's actually been a high-risk prisoner who's had to develop the infection and get hospitalized. That would pose a completely new challenge to both the healthcare professionals looking after them as well as the security around them.
So Dr. Rehan, I actually have I have a comment on this. I actually have a friend who's a prison doctor, and I was talking to him just last week here in Virginia, and what he told me was, yes, this is a big concern, because if there's an outbreak in a prison, it'll be very hard to control it. So what they've actually done is they have created these separate units, separate wards, if you want to call them, where every new inmate who comes in, first is pre-screened, temperature, symptoms, and all of that. And then for 14 days, when they come into the prison, they're actually put in a separate prison, in a separate section of the prison, with no contact whatsoever with the prisoners who are already in jail. And after 14 days, if you have no symptoms or you've recovered, only then are they put in the regular prison. And yes, you're right about, prisoners who are there for smaller crimes or petty crimes, they're actually being let go just because of the magnitude of this problem.
Thank you. I am wrapping up the call. So I want to recognize, Dr. Taruj Ali, Dr. Dinesh, for the excellent presentation. Thank you so much for giving us the overview of the COVID, its impact, in general, and what's the take both in US and UK by the current physicians, and what's the fight for the COVID, going on latest. So I would like to acknowledge a couple of individuals, Sunita Vishwanath ji, co-founder of Hindus for Human Rights, Raju Rajgopal ji, co-founder for Hindus for Human Rights, Dr. Manish Madan, Global Indian Progressive Alliance, Dr. Rehan, International Society for Peace and Justice, and our own Ramakrishna Jalla, who is our IT cell coordinator, who coordinates. Thank you so much for all of you. I want to thank Motika Anand, Debalina, Wahed, and everyone who participated and coordinated this call, and also for the people who joined the call. I would like to have a special thanks for all of you, and hopefully we stay safe. We try to do our best. And Raju sir, if you want to add few, we are going to wrap up the call. Thank you. Raju sir, you can add few lines, and then Ramakrishna Jalla will let us know the official end.
I am, on behalf of all of you, I think we are immensely grateful for both of you for taking the time out from your life-saving work to be with us. It was really, really informative and uplifting in many ways. Thank you. And for everybody's information, this entire 2-hour call has been recorded, and it is something that I would like to share widely with friends and physicians or otherwise. I would like you all to give it wider coverage to your own families and friends and so forth. Again, thank you, and thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Taruj and Dr.
I just want to say thank you, Dr. Jamil, for organizing this, and thank our two speakers. It is great. The information was invaluable, and we should provide the recordings to the people who were not able to join.
Sure, it's on the Facebook of the Indian Americans Forum. I will share it with everybody, Dr. Rehan.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you all. So we are winding up now. So we are closing this meeting. So we have another one in the after next 2 weeks, like 28th of March on immigration. So just want to announce that one. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, so we are going to have on April the 26th, the Sunday, with one of the immigration attorneys on the impact of COVID on the H-1B and other visa holders. So please kindly join that call as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Is Ramakrishna, are we done officially?
Yes.
Recording and everything is okay?
Yep. Thank you. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.